Good afternoon. We're here at the racetrack in Warsaw, 8th edition of the Kongres 590. Lots of fabulous, fantastic guests. And it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Robert Wade, Professor of Global Political Economy, London School of Economics. You've barely made it, sir, but I'm very happy that you did.
So am I.
It was a close call. The question of how much the state should interfere in economic matters comes up regularly in many debates. Is it possible to answer this question by referring to different economic models that function in different cultural societies?
Well, first of all, I would question the use of the word interfere.
Okay.
The more neutral word would be intervene, as in intervene in the economy. But even that is misleading, because that implies that the economy exists over here, and over here is the
Two
state.
bubbles, you mean?
And the state sometimes intervenes in the economy as though the economy would otherwise function more or less well on its own. But the point is, there's always been historically a close interaction between states and economies.
Connected, right?
Yes. So to say intervene in the economy is misleading, in the sense that the states are always intervening.
Yeah, we got this feeling that they always do.
Yes. I mean, that, and in a way that's one of the functions of states.
They have to, right?
And so one of the key issues has been whether the state should concentrate on what are called horizontal policies. Horizontal meaning they affect all sectors, like, for example, primary education across all sectors, or in terms of firms, subsidies for all exporters. So that's not at all vertical, that's horizontal. But the debate has been, should the state supplement horizontal policies, like to encourage exports, but all exports, with more vertically targeted or sector-targeted measures to promote certain sectors ahead of other sectors, whether by tariffs or by subsidies or by other kinds of regulations. That's where the debate is. And right now, almost as we speak, in the US, really for the past 2 years, there's been a dramatic revolution in thinking about this issue. It's a sort of unheralded revolution in thinking about international economics, but also domestic economics. And what the US state is doing now, in a way much more than it did before, is vertical or sector-targeted policies in certain high-tech sectors. And the high-tech sectors very much include semiconductors, because, I mean, semiconductors are what oil was.
This is the key, right?
Yes, semiconductors are the key, just like oil was the key. And the US has fallen way behind China and Taiwan and South Korea and Japan.
They didn't realize that for a long while. Huh?
Exactly, in advanced semiconductors, not all semiconductors, but advanced semiconductors. And now there's a great big push to give huge subsidies for producers in America. So this is not subsidies to American chip companies to make them in Taiwan or in Vietnam. This is subsidies to make them
like
in America.
Used to, right?
Yes, exactly, to make them in America. And another main sort of sector focus of this industrial policy, industrial strategy, is the whole range of green technologies, especially batteries, especially electric vehicles, and all the supply chains related to those things, those green things. And if you ask why this has happened, and it is really dramatic, and people in Poland, which has been the very epicenter of free market thinking, keep the state out of the economy, people in Poland have to realize this. There is this dramatic change going on, led by the US, and Europe is kind of racing to catch up. But the reason why all this is happening is because the US has decided that China is a major threat to U.S. national security.
Which is, actually.
The U.S. has to make its strategic supply chains, like in semiconductors, like in certain green technologies, it has to make them, and this is the phrase, China safe. China safe. That is, make sure that the U.S. Has enough production within the U.S., or at least in friends, allies, that China cannot use its control of key inputs, such as, for example, lithium going into batteries, to strike back against the U.S. As you know, the U.S. is surrounding China, especially in the Western Pacific, with military bases, and China does not like it. China feels threatened, and one of the ways that China can punch back is to, for example, withhold supplies of key inputs that the U.S. economy depends on. Yeah. And so this, I think, is the nature of the political economy game, if you will, that's being played out. What is so dramatic is the way that geopolitics, which used to be quite separate from the economy, I mean, even during the Cold War, there was geopolitics over here, and then there was the economy. But we did not depend on Russia or the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The Soviet Union was dangerous, and we were dangerous to the Soviet Union, but geopolitics and the economy were separate. What has been happening now in the last few years is that geopolitics is driving economic policy, including the return to legitimacy of discussion about industrial strategy. That's, it seems to me, the essence of what's happening. And people in Poland who believe in the free market really should pay attention to
the changes,
to these changes. Yes.
What would you say to the opponents of the return of the activist state in industrial policies who claim this is return to socialism?
Well, but I mean, clearly the U.S. is not moving towards socialism.
You never know.
No. I don't think there's any prospect of that whatsoever.
Well, socialism means different in the West and in the East, as you know, right?
Yes, but I mean, this is very far from socialism. It's really important to make the point. The US is not doing this, quote, intervention across the board. It's really targeting certain high-tech sectors in which the US thinks that it is vulnerable to other countries cutting off.
They don't want to be dependent
supplies. On. Yes, exactly. They don't want to be dependent. And so the key phrases now are phrases like resilient trade as distinct from free trade. Free trade can leave us too vulnerable to supply cutoffs. We need resilient trade, and that means we need to make sure that production of key items is being done either in America or in Europe, or in friends.
Yeah, you said that, so yeah, we understand.
Yeah.
Another question, how to look for an answer to the burning problem of many Western societies, which is the privatization of profits and socialization of costs of corporate activity. I guess you have to agree with that.
Well, yes. I mean, and that is a very big problem. Rates of profit have been going up across the board, even as wages have remained stagnant in real terms. And so that this is something where any responsible democratic government should be, quote, intervening in order to certainly raise minimum wages. But then there's a question, what about putting a ceiling on maximum profits? And so these issues now are under discussion in a kind of lively way, as they've not been for a very long time. In many ways, the world is in a pretty bad state, but for a social scientist, it's really interesting now.
Sure.
I mean, much more interesting because of all these upheavals and things like the economy coming into geopolitics into the economy, which just makes it a whole lot more complex and a whole lot more interesting.
One more question about banking, because is the banking system currently safe? Should the state intervene? Let's hope that
Yes.
you're going to accept this word,
Yes.
like Obama did.
Yes.
Should they do that?
Well, that was during the crisis, the great
But I think the banks are the
2008
way they are.
crisis.
They didn't change. They keep collapsing.
Yes, they do. And at least we know that in the US, the big banks, which were required to raise their capital adequacy base after 2008, the big banks have not been threatened. The banks that have collapsed are the
Smaller
sort of the smaller or the medium-sized.
Mismanaged banks. Yeah.
Yes. But there's
So we
no
shouldn't be
doubt
afraid, you figure.
that worldwide there is a huge debt problem. And I think that that's the case in much of Eastern and Central Europe as well. But it's very much the case in developing countries. And many developing countries are actually sort of going backwards rather than growing forwards because they've taken on so much debt.
Sri Lanka.
Yes, and US interest rates have gone very high, but also many African countries. US interest rates have gone very high, so their debt repayments have gone way up, and they are close to debt default. So this is, in a certain way, a repeat of the situation that began in Latin America in the 1980s with a collapse of Mexico and a whole lot of others. And then later in East Asia in the late 1990s, and then again in 2008. And so now it's very sad to think that we, after these three international debt crises, we may be heading into yet another one.
Unfortunately.
And that's only, how long, 5 years later, after the last mega crisis. So,
Professor Robert Waite, with so many topics to discuss, but
Yes.
we are short of time, so thank you much for popping
Okay.
into our studio. I hope that you're going to watch our streaming, that you want to watch us on internet. We are still open. Please come visit us. There are lots of interesting people, like Professor Waite will be having a lecture tomorrow. I guess, yeah? Tomorrow
at 12, I think.
at 12. So Professor Waite will elaborate more on this subject tomorrow at 12. And we are here at the racetrack in Warsaw, so you are welcome. Please watch us. Another interview is on the way. Thank you.